Many thanks for joining. You are watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is weekly program Future Africa, and I am Fantam Walete hosting the program. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Tegenu Gosa, a researcher on African history, who joins me from Israel. Doctor, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Mr. Fantam. Thank you for having me.
Africa has been considered as center of war and violent conflict. Why is it always narrated like that, and what were the real causes?
It's a good question. It's to be honest, it's not about being narrated as such. Because it's simply put, it's because it is true. And since Africa became independent from colonialism, for the last roughly 70 years, war has been raging, and there is constant cycle of war and lot of wars across Africa. And many countries in Africa are suffering from this one or another form of conflict. And you can see until today, you can see what's going on in Sudan right now as we speak. War is raging, and the country's unity is in serious uh, problem. And of course, we witnessed another very catastrophic war in our country, Ethiopia, in the last 2 years, 3 years, which came to an end, of course. So it's a reality. It's an African reality, and there is no way to put in any other way the general aspect of African politics is in forefront. What you find is this war and tragedy of war and the outcome of war and all kinds of crises that emanates from war issues. And to give you another example, since 2021, just last 2 years, and nearly about 5 countries experienced coup d'etats. It happened in Chad, it happened in Mali, and of course, it happened also in Sudan, which is again in another cycle of conflict. And it happened in Burkina Faso. It has been attempted last year in Guinea, even though it was not successful. So you can see the conflict has been there, and as a continental general issue, we could not be able to put this thing behind us. And most part of Africa, in one way or another, and different times, for many reasons, are experiencing these clashes, conflicts, and wars, civil wars. And yeah, this is a reality in Africa, and it's not about narration and political settlement and living in peace has been really a big issue in Africa. And I don't think it's a matter of just narration. It has serious element of reality.
Colonial borderlines are considered as one of the major causes for conflict in borderlines in Africa. What do you say on this?
Yes, yes and no. Yes, maybe because these colonial borders do not describe African reality. There's just cutting across ethnic ethnic groups, and these boundaries are, as most of the historians agree with me, they're uh, imposed upon Africans, and they do not describe African political realities in its natural or in its entirely African societal developmental state. It doesn't describe, and it's true that there are boundaries across already existing conflicts across existing boundaries, and conflicts and claims and counterclaims of territories along the already demarcated or the already existing boundaries has been there in Africa. But once these boundaries are recognized and the countries become independent and sovereign nations of their own, the majority of conflicts are actually happening within the country. And most of the source, if you ask me, of the conflicts in African countries are related to power. Uh, who wants to lead the country and who wants to benefit as such from what power gives you. And it's not entirely because the boundaries are so fluid and not in line with African reality that they're causing any significant threat. And we're living with it. The boundaries are all there for the last 17 years, and many countries are becoming independent. And South Sudan is a recent history. And it's not far away that Eritrea became an independent nation uh, 30 years ago or something like that. And there was a serious conflict and on claim along the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And of course, this is one reason. But what's the reason for the rest of the country who do not necessarily have claims of boundaries or conflict over boundaries? And this has been happening in Nigeria. And what's the reason for coup d'etats in many countries? And of course, in the countries I've been describing earlier. And the reason is just power grab. And the reason is not being able to form a government that's inclusive and that can work for the will of the people across countries. And so it's related to power, and it's related to our inability as an African, or if I speak on behalf of Africans, our inability to form a stable government and the lack of social cohesion and agreeing on the on the stable future of one's country. That's how I can put. So yes, it's contributing to the already existing problems, the issue of boundary, but I don't think this is a major one. And do you think if from day one, when African countries became independent, as Nkrumah has been and his groups have been pushing, if Africa was united from day one, do you think these conflicts will go away? I personally do not think so, because we have series of issues within the already existing boundaries. Case in point being what happened in Ethiopia, in our own country, the last 2 years. See, we don't the conflict or the war that had happened in the last 2 years in northern part of Ethiopia has got nothing to do with bound. It's an internal matter. It's something that came out of the need to grab central politics of the country, and it's an issue related to all this kind of stuff. So the issue of forming good government, stable government, is far from being the reality in many countries in Africa. And of course, there are few examples of stable governments in Africa, of course. If you mention countries like Mauritius, like Botswana, these are examples of successful, stable, democratic governments since independence. And these are but few, and they do not really describe the bigger reality of Africa.
Do you think that trends such as population pressure and socio-economic challenges make the societies fragile?
Yes, indeed. And when you don't have stable government that can work for the will of the people to alleviate poverty and bring about economic prosperity and infrastructural change, developments, all kind of stuff. Yes, and population keeps growing, and population is not only growing in Africa in the last 70 years, let me say, after independence. It's exponentially growing in Africa, exponentially growing in Africa. And so, and all societal needs, basic needs related to shelter, food, basic infrastructure is not keeping up with the pace of population growth. As a result, we have a serious mismatch and distress and all kinds of economic problems and crises. And that's why we do have not only these factors I'm talking about contributing to wars and conflicts, but also we are suffering from another immigration or migration is another illegal migration is another issue. Not only the illegal ones, even the legal ones, is a serious problem in Africa. The most educated part of Africans are just leaving the continent, and in an issue what we consider as brain drain is a major serious challenge for African countries. We should not only talk about the illegal migration that is becoming again another face of Africa, where people are continuously run from problems, economic hardships, conflicts, and all this kind of stuff. Yes, in all fronts we are suffering, and uh, the issue of population growth is again something that requires serious attention if we want to address even the political problems we see in Africa. But again, unless there is stability and unless there is stable government working and functioning government put in place, there is no way that economic progress and development that would lead to social stability can be guaranteed. And this is again something of a huge challenge in Africa today.
What does African integration, be it economic or political, look like on the ground? And what are the challenges regarding this integration?
This is another good question. And if I honestly speak about African unity, it's really one of the sad stories about Africa. And I can consider it's a missed opportunity, really, to be honest. And I'm not saying that this is a dead end. There is no way African unity will not be guaranteed in the future, and we should just walk away from this concept. Yeah, and it's still high agenda, and African people, especially the educated elites, speak about this topic a lot. And there are scholars in Africa who consider the way forward for Africa to solve all the problems we have been talking, politically, economic, social, whatever, is actually creating African unity on the ground. But since day one, since the day one is since independence, this topic or this agenda has been there, but it went nowhere, and it's not moving anywhere. And in reality, on the ground, this even though on media, from scholars, academicians talk about this agenda, and of course prescribe it to be the solution, the serious solution to African problem, and it's not going anywhere. And as you know, uh, even before Organization of African Unity was formed in 1963, there were two groups and blocks of newly independent countries with different agendas related to the future of Africa, at least politically. And there was the Casablanca and the Monrovia group, and it's the capital of Liberia. And the Casablanca bloc was formed by 7 countries, uh, and they met in Morocco, Casablanca, in 1961. And the proponents of this bloc, this group generally were opposing unity of Africa, political unity of Africa from day one, just after independence. So the proponents of this being the Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, Sekou Touré of Mali, and the leaders of Libya, Morocco, Algeria, and Guinea. All these newly independent countries were proposing that Africa should be united from day one. But there are another group that met a little bit later in the same year, 1961, in Monrovia, Casablanca, Liberia. This is composed of almost 12 countries, including our own country, Ethiopia, under Emperor Haile Selassie, Nigeria, Senegal, Democratic Republic of Congo, and many others, who were opposing this idea, and who rather suggested that African political unity should be considered or should come eventually and we should focus on integrating Africa economically first, and then we will gradually unite Africa politically. So, where are we? This is what had happened even before Organization of African Unity was established in 1963. By the way, OAU has been established as a compromise between these two groups. And they came together, they compromised. So the idea of unifying Africa from day one, the Nkrumah group has to give up. And so they somehow agreed on this gradual African unity proposal. And OAU was born as such. And what had happened and did OAU move forward with this agenda, if you ask me, or member countries moving forward with this agenda? I hardly think so. And for example, there is the idea of integrating Africa economically first and then political unity coming next, is always talked about in today's AU, African Union's meetings, year in, year out, when these leaders meet every year annually. They talk about this topic. And recently, of course, you know that the African Free Trade Area as a maybe as a dispensation of this economic integration affair has been launched, and many countries have signed and of course ratified by their parliament, so that African countries can trade with each other without any customs duties, any hard boundary lines, in a bid to economically integrate Africa. But what's happening on the ground, even related to this free trade area, is it operational? No, not yet. And I don't think this is seriously considered, and there is a commission for it. There are all personnel established for it under AU, and where is it going so far? I have no idea in particular case of this one. So the African unity on the ground hardly moving forward, but there are moves, as I told you, like with this creating free trade area for the entire Africa, so that African countries can trade with one another and exchange commodities rather than trading with Europe, rather than trading with China, rather than trading always with America. It's better to trade with one another, so that this will create cohesion, economic cohesion and interdependence that can serve as a solid foundation for the so-called political unity that leaders and of course academicians are aspiring to see to happen. And but is it moving in a pace that is uh, expected? I don't think so. Is it moving forward somehow? I think so. But 70 years in a making, um, nothing really has been materialized yet. And I hope it will happen. It's better late than never. Huh?
How can we build a stable and a peaceful Africa?
I cannot prescribe a solution for the entire Africa, and because
Just
we're
your idea,
talking
your
about
suggestion.
50. Yeah, we are talking here about 53 countries and maybe 54 now. You know, like the reality of each country and the stage in even governance, experience of governance of every country is very different. But the way forward is having, as everybody says so, having at least democratic government. What do I mean by democratic government? It's not the one people propagate, talk about on the media. At least having a government with popular say and popular determination of some kind. And establishing a government that can really work for the interests of the people. Establishing a government that can alleviate poverty so that people can live in peace in their own yard, in their own country. And a government that can manage to instill some hope in its own citizens so that they can aspire to live and see future in their own country than just thinking all the time about like leaving a country and living abroad. And so forming a stable government in Africa is seriously an issue. And many countries are not able to uh, do that. And how can it be done? The reality is different for each country, but this is a serious matter, and because many countries could not. So, and African, even the countries, the colonial boundaries, and African countries, as we know today, are suffering from serious problem of cohesion, social basis, and agreement on the future of their country and the framework, political framework I'm speaking, is a serious issue. And it's still serious issue. And there are many political topics like different entities within countries are not agreeing upon. And how can this be hammered out and really stable governments can be formed is up to each and every nation and citizens to contribute. So, but the biggest responsibility again falls on people sitting in power. There is no doubt about that. Whether if it requires compromising even their own power, they have to settle for that, and they have to move forward with that. And it's second to nothing. And you do have a responsible government and forming a solid basis for this kind of stable government, democratic government for that matter, listening to the will of the people. It's fundamental. It's irreplaceable, to be honest. I cannot say, like I cannot encourage Africans to do that and do this one. And because when people rise, it usually ends up with conflict. It usually ends up with clashes along ethnic line, along religious line, along clan line, all these kind of topic. And so it's an assignment primarily of whoever it is and whoever it is, the government sitting and leading countries to sit, encourage groups in political entities to enter into, no matter how long it is, into a dialogue so that the political arrangement, suitable political arrangement, depending on the reality of each country, can be forged. This is very, very crucial. Otherwise, the result will be what we saw the last 2 years in our country. Otherwise, the result would be what we are witnessing in Sudan today. Very, very bad reality. So it's really to be it's the homework of everyone, I can say, and primarily it's the homework of African governments and people who are leading African countries.
How do you evaluate the role of continental organizations in Africa, like African Union, in addressing climate issues, dispute resolution, and even fostering African unification or African integration?
When it comes to the continental body like AU, the previous Organization of African Unity, and historians, when they study the achievements and failures of African Union since it was formed, of course, now it's almost about close to 60 something years, close to 70 years. So it's more than a quarter of a century that this organization has lived, and what it really achieved during all this time. People mention somehow AU was behind, and it contributed a lot in the independence of countries that were to be freed from colonialism late, and in settling some of the conflicts in Africa. Yes, AU has done a lot, including what had happened, of course, the resolution of the conflict in Ethiopia. AU and AU chairman, AU has played a very significant role, and they played really positive role. But this much, having said that, this depends on the will of countries also, to be honest. Other than that, in, as I've mentioned earlier, in forging the roadmap for integration, economic integration, and then eventually political integration of Africa. I don't think much is being done, mainly because I can mention now we cannot say no, I cannot want to go to the lengths of like it's a failure, nothing is happening, and AU is not doing much. I don't want to portray this picture, and rather what I want to see is African Union itself is not a free body, to be honest, because one, the mandate given to it is very marginal one. What do I mean? There are charters, there are goals set out when this organization was reformed and when this organization was initially established. But in order to enforce these goals, these whatever plans AU aspire to achieve, there is no means of enforcing it. AU has no force. AU has no military power. AU has no, maybe, how can I, the power to enforce what it aspires to achieve in any country. AU has no like peacekeeping mission or peacekeeping force of its own. So the mandate given to it and is a very nominal one, to be honest. And as a result of which there is no way they can enforce. They can encourage leaders to meet, to talk, to discuss in the annual meetings and ministerial meetings. But how can AU be able to enforce all this? There is no mechanism. There is no power given to it. And second, there is an issue of budget. Sadly, African Union itself gets the biggest share of its funding from abroad, from donor nations, EU, America. These are the countries that are financing the entire operation of African Union. So it has no economic freedom of its own. And when this country, when these institutions like EU and America donates money for the operation of African Union, it's not for free that they are doing all these things. There is a bargain, there is a demand in the back door that comes. So African Union cannot stand for the will and the interest of Africa with full force unless it guarantees its own financial freedom and unless power of enforcing its own goals and its own agendas is given to it by African leaders themselves. So in a condition where there is no means and mechanism of enforcing agendas of its own, in a condition where it has no financial freedom to do so and to plan so, I don't think African Union can go to any lengths than what it is currently doing. So we cannot lie to ourselves. African governments need to allocate budget from, even if it's supposed to come from their own GDP contribution, like of course EU has been doing, is doing, like the Americans are doing, whatever. One, as I said, is an issue of mandate. You have to put the mandate is not given to it, and it has no enforcing mechanism. And of course, this enforcing mechanism is not put in place. And the mandate to enforce whatever resolutions, whatever decisions, whatever agendas are put forward is not implemented, or it's facing serious setback in the process of implementation. And the second topic is, as I said, the issue of finance, budget. And AU is yet to secure its budget source but from member states only. The majority or the larger share of African Union's operational budget comes from what they call partner countries. And these partner countries, we know these are the Western powers, the Americans, the European Union, and this kind of stuff. And when these guys, as I told you, provide you with money, there is indirect or direct form of influence that will come. And as the saying goes, of course, there is Thomas Sankara says that he who feeds you controls you. That makes sense right here. And when aid money flows into Africa in general, I'm not talking specifically about AU here. When aid money flows into Africa, yes, be prepared to pay back in one or another form. And because there is no free lunch here. And when AU receives its donation or budget money directly from all these partner countries, which we know who they are, they wield some kind of influence on you. So African Union is yet to guarantee its own freedom, financial freedom, and yet it is yet to have the backbone to enforce agendas it's bringing about, and it is yet to ask for real mandate to enforce from member states. And African Union needs to move forward in this direction and demand mandate. It requires to enforce continental agendas. And African Union is yet to move forward with the agenda of representing Africa in international organizations like United Nations. Africa has no permanent membership seat in Security Council. And in the forefront, it's supposed to be African Union that should have pushed for this agenda because it has no independence, financial, and it's not mandated to do so by African countries. It's not moving forward with this topic. And it's individual countries that are just pushing this idea of better representation of Africa with its own interest in the international arena. So there is this serious challenge for African Union, let alone to contribute positively in the economic, social, political realities of Africa, even for it to stand on its 2 feet and implement whatever agendas it has, it's facing this kind of serious challenges. So I would evaluate not much is being done, but whenever there is a will from member countries, of course it's contributing. The case here in point is the peace settlement in Ethiopia that happened a few months ago. It's the will of Ethiopian government to promote, to believe in African solution to African problem. When there is a will from government, and of course AU can contribute, and it has contributed a lot. But when there is no will, as I told you, African Union has no means of enforcing peace in the continent. That's why war is raging, and that's why when war is raging in countries, it is United Nations, the bigger like international bodies that are wielding more power. That of course warring parties are listening to, and nobody pays attention to whatever AU says because they know AU generally is almost toothless. No means. And AU should demand so bigger mandate to enforce resolutions it adopts related to any topic. It can be economic, it can be political, it can be conflict resolution related. And AU needs to move in this direction. Otherwise, it will be meaningless. Its existence will be meaningless. And as I said, it has been almost 70 years since its existence. It is soon to be 70 years. And existing by itself is not something to count as a merit. And it should demand. So
There are drought-prone African countries that are being highly affected by food security impacts due to climate impacts in the region. What are the actions that African leaders have been taking to put an end to this tragedy?
The region we are living in, Horn of Africa, is seriously affected by, seriously suffering from climate change induced crisis. And whether it is in the form of shortage of rain and crop failure as a result, and whether it is droughts induced by, again, shortage of rain or absence of rain, which had happened, of course, over the last 4 years until it rained very recently. There was really drought inflicted by absence of rain in the Horn of Africa, especially in the lowland areas, Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, all these countries, all these areas. And as a result of which, you can see that starvation and serious eviction, migration is becoming a reality. And so African countries, if they want to focus on pro-poor poverty alleviation programs, especially focusing on less very susceptible parts of their own country, they need to conserve their budget, and allocating budget is an issue. And of course, related to this topic, let me address a very bigger agenda here. And this is related with the issue of corruption. Issue of corruption. Corruption is one topic, but there is, in 2020, there is a report that came out, I think a study by United Nations itself. There is a Commission for Trade and Development or something like that. So they reported on the capital flight from Africa. And the report, it's generally called illicit financial flow or illicit financial flight. The money that leaves Africa in the form of corruption and any other illicit forms. And it says annually Africa loses more than $80 billion in this capital flight, in this IFF, international illicit financial flow. Imagine $80 billion, most of which, I'm talking about a report and you can access it, and this is available online. So there is no lie in this topic. Imagine what this $80 billion could do if it remains in Africa and if it's invested on African people. Compare it with one mega project where that's underway, the GERD. Its cost could be like, with delay and everything, it could be up to like $10 billion, right? And if it is, let's calculate roughly, it could be like $8 billion. So it can build this money, every yin can build 10 GERD size projects in Africa. And in 10 years, 100 of these, which means the issue of electricity and power would not be there in Africa if our money is invested and if African peoples own their money. And who is responsible in this illicit financial flows? Primarily governments and agents, brokers. Corruption has the biggest role in this one. And if you really want to know, and of course, people who listen to your program, I really encourage them to watch a recently released undercover investigation by Al Jazeera, English channel, entitled Gold Mafia. It comes in 4 episodes, 1, 2, 3, 4. And it shows in this gold mafia how brokers and people are collaborating in the chain in which the gold from Africa ends up in foreign countries. Not only the gold itself, how these illegal traders are laundering dollars, making it the informally gained dollar convert them into a very legal money. approved. So this program, I really encourage people to listen to it and to watch it, and it's really informative, and it shows clearly showcases what we are talking about in terms of illicit financial flows out of Africa. This is really an eye opener program. So why do I mention all this topic? As long as corruption is there, as long as we could not be able to form a stable, I said before, and responsible government, accountable government, there is no way we can own our own money. Taxpayers' money could be invested back on the society and change the economic life of our own people. So again, the biggest responsibility is on governments in fighting corruption. Corruption is not, we talk seriously about conflicts, and behind conflicts, there is this corruption. Why do people run to grab power? Why do they fight with one another? I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the topic, it's a rush for power. What do people do with power? Why do they rush to power? Because it involves money, secure money. You have power, you have access to money. Corruption, serious problem in Africa. And if any African country does not have non-corrupt government, and the blessing of that country is literally guaranteed. And so we have to have a serious mechanism, and African governments should take this seriously, and African people need to pay attention to this topic, need to pay attention in the election campaigns and the election process, whether their leaders are paying enough attention to fighting corruption. And really, corruption is undercutting our progress and in many ways than one. And unless we fight this thing seriously, I don't think we can speak or aspire or demand much about economic change and change in livelihood of Africans.
What do you think should be the role and the response of these governments to address this drought and famine in the countries?
Climate crisis is a global issue, but who is suffering it? Who is suffering in the forefront? Poor countries. We are suffering from the effect of climate change. So if governments want to fight this climate crisis and the effect of climate crisis, do we really need to fight corruption? It's a serious agenda. And poverty alleviation is a matter of survival. And it can be done. And we have seen it. And countries in the world have done it. And China 30 years ago was a developing country. In the last 30 years, 1970s, of course, it is now 40 years or more. It's a developing country. And in the last 40 years, China managed to alleviate 500 million people from poverty. China managed to extricate 500 million people from poverty. The same thing happened in Brazil. Under Lula da Silva and his predecessor, who is now again back to power, he managed to extricate 10 million people from poverty under his leadership. This is a pro-poor policies. He invested on infrastructure, invested on education, they invested on remedial programs, focusing on the poor. And then they managed to extricate these people, this much people, in relatively short period of time. So this is if responsible government, accountable government, put an end to fight this illegally or in an illicit form flowing money out of their country. there is a bigger chance that this money will be invested within a country and solve our serious problems on the ground. So the issue of fighting climate, the issue of good governance, the issue of pro-poor or poverty alleviation programs, and the issue of infrastructure are all related. So if we want to address problems of our society, we really need to form a very responsible, stable government. I should underline these topics, and accountable governance. And again, the biggest responsibility falls on African governments, to be honest.
How do you evaluate the role Ethiopia is playing to stem this climate impact, especially in providing clean energy and in green legacy initiative?
It's a good question, and now we can pinpoint to a specific country and talk about specific examples. In which case, Ethiopian government is doing well. This is my assessment. In the green legacy, the attempt being made to rehabilitate degraded environments and degraded landscapes and planting trees is really a very good initiative, and it's an exemplary one. And of course, in the region that's being affected by or suffering seriously from the climate-induced, let me call it that way, and also it's a human impact. It's in the degradation. We cannot blame the climate change. It's a human-induced problem, to be honest. So the Green Legacy Initiative is a good initiative. It's a very, very good initiative, and it can bring about serious change. But one thing I should add: this is only half of the role of the play, and Ethiopian government needs to pay attention to preserving the already existing biodiversity spots in the country that are left in the country. And I do not think enough attention is being paid to preserving the already existing forest landscapes. There is a massive clearance of forests going on, and there is a lot of reports coming out of Ethiopia every time. The national parks of Ethiopia are under serious stress from infiltration and population settlement and all this kind of stuff. And this Green Legacy Initiative should be integrated and intertwined with the issue of preserving and protecting the already existing biodiversity centers and the already existing natural environments in Ethiopia. It's only if we integrate these two that we can achieve the best success story in terms of environmental protection and also poverty alleviation. And the best example of and what is being done in terms of promoting tourism by building, of course, constructing some lodges and tourism hosting centers, let me call it that way, is a good manifestation on behalf of the government that things can change for better if managed properly and invested in it. But I really want to emphasize that we need to give attention to really preserving and conserving the national parks and the natural habitats that survived so far. And we need to continue to push forward with the Green Legacy Initiative of rehabilitating the already degraded environment. And the combination of the two will create will bring about serious change in terms of securing our future source of food and livelihood.
How do you see the implementation of the multiple international agreements on funding severely impacted nations through carbon trading and related practices?
Yeah, as I said earlier, this carbon trade whatever. We do not necessarily need to put this topic into like we can sell the carbon and we benefit from that one. And the issue of conserving and preserving our environment is a matter of survival, to be honest. Especially if we put this thing in a context of the bigger danger we are facing related to the climate crisis. And I said we are the ones in the forefront in terms of suffering the consequence of climate change. So it should be now. And we should put the biggest effort into conserving our environment, into programs that would protect the environment in general, as it's being done. And of course, it's a good beginning, good initiative, and we are in some part of the country we're seeing really the effect of the outcome, of course, of this program in general. And if we keep up with if keep up the momentum and continue to build up on what has been achieved so far, really we're going to see a very positive change in this regard. And I hope this will be integrated with, again, the protection and conservation mechanism to given to the already existing natural habitats and the biodiversity centers in Ethiopia. In which case, the biodiversity centers where I'm speaking about are not something else, just mostly the natural forests and national parks that are existing in the country. But this should be protected, and this is very much crucial one. And as you know, like there is nature has a tipping point. You can plant tree, but you cannot restore the biodiversity. And once this line is crossed, and we lose this biodiversity center, even if we plant trees, we might have a forest, but we cannot bring back the life, the balanced life in there. So that's why we should pay almost equal attention to protecting and conserving the naturally existing environments. And in as much as we are paying attention to the rehabilitation, afforestation, reforestation programs that's underway, it's very much important. And Africa in general is a hotspot of biodiversity in the world in general. And our country is also one of the significant countries in terms of biodiversity. And we should really encourage stakeholders to invest much to work on this topic. And it's a very crucial one. And down the line, of course, as you said, we can benefit from even selling the carbon in the future arrangements in the global stage, in the face of the climate crisis and how to mitigate this climate crisis, whatever. And there will be plans that will come. And of course, countries will share a responsibility based on their contribution to the climate crisis. And as we know, the biggest contributors to the carbon emission are the developed nations. And there is a pressure on these countries to help the poorer countries who are suffering firsthand. And this comes in the form of carbon trade and all this kind of stuff. So who will benefit the most? The country that prepares the most. And if we conserve our environment, and if our contribution to the green economy is visible, definitely we are going to get even much support that would come down the line. So, but primarily, as I said, we're not doing this for the sake of gaining some support from the West. No, we are doing this because it's a matter of our own livelihood and the livelihood of our people. And the environment is our landscapes in the majority of the cases are very fragile, and we should really pay attention to this topic. And because in the coming century, and climate-induced issues and problems are going to even outclass the issue of conflict, political, whatever conflict we are talking about, and it's going to fuel the already existing problems we do have related to, the political problems, economic problems we do have are going to be exacerbated even further unless we pay attention to these environment, climate, and biodiversity topics.
Have you got any final message to convey for people watching us?
Thank you again, and that much has been said. And what I want to emphasize again is that Africa, in general, the future of Africa is in the hand of its own people. And I expect African Union to play a much bigger role than it's playing right now. And I expect the African Union to stretch its legs and have the stamina to require more mandate from member states, especially in enforcing resolutions. And of course, demand more from member states in terms of securing its own financial freedom. Other than that, the African youth, if mobilized properly, I think in this century, people are well aware and the platforms are there to mobilize African youth around this agenda of African unity and Pan-Africanism. And Ethiopian youth is very much mobilized, and everybody is realizing the last 2 years conflict have given us a lesson that our future is intertwined as a country, and we should continue to promote this national agenda. The national dialogue that's going to come will have a very much positive effect on establishing a platform of political arrangement, stable political arrangement, and in laying out a stable political arrangement in the country. And I hope this will happen. And Africa in general need to move forward on these topics we have discussed. And I hope the future will be bright and the war in Sudan will come to an end soon. I really, really hope. And I thank you.
Dr. Tegenu Gosa, a researcher on African history, thank you for your precious time and for joining me.
Thank you for having me, and have a good day.
Dear our esteemed viewers, this brings us to the end. Thank you for watching.